One family ruled the Ottoman Empire for its entire existence. Not a dynasty that fell and was restored, not a line that was replaced by rivals, but one house descended from one man holding the throne without a break for more than 6 centuries. 36 rulers in a single unbroken chain. There is almost nothing else like it in the history of the world, and the empire it governed stretched across 3 continents and only ended within the lifetime of people whose grandchildren are alive tonight. We are going to take the whole of that story slowly, from the first small frontier settlement to the very last day. If you would rather listen with your screen dark, this channel is on Spotify as well, and the link is sitting in the description below. Before the pace drops away, I would love to know which part of the world you are listening from and what the clock says where you are. And now let us slow right down. There is nothing here that needs your attention. 600 years is a long time to cover, and I am going to take it gently, and none of it will be lost if you stop following. If you drift away somewhere in the 14th century and surface again in the 19th, that is exactly what this is for. The story does not need a witness. So let the pillow take the weight of your head. Let your hands go soft. Let your jaw unclench. Because most of us are holding it without noticing. Whatever you are carrying into tonight, you can put it down at the edge of the bed and pick it up tomorrow if it still seems worth carrying. We are going to travel a long way. Across a dry plateau, down to a narrow strait between 2 seas, into a walled city, out to the deserts and the mountains and the great rivers, and eventually into the modern world. Slowly. One thing at a time. Let me begin somewhere very small. A cup of coffee. Not a large one. A small cup, thick porcelain or fine china, holding perhaps a mouthful or 2. The coffee in it is not filtered. The grounds have been ground to a powder finer than flour and brought slowly to the edge of a boil in a small long-handled pot, sometimes twice, so that a layer of foam forms on top. And pouring it correctly means getting that foam into the cup. You do not stir it. You sip from the top, and you stop before you reach the bottom, because the bottom is a soft sediment of grounds, and everyone knows to leave it. A glass of water comes alongside, something sweet, often on the saucer. That drink, prepared that way, is served today from Sarajevo to Cairo, from Athens to Baghdad, from Belgrade to Beirut, and it is called by a different name in almost every one of those places, and in several of them there are people who will tell you with some feeling that the name used next door is wrong. It came to all of them from the same place. It came through the Ottoman Empire. Coffee itself came from further away, from Ethiopia originally, and then through Yemen, where Sufi communities used it to stay awake through night devotions. In the 16th century, it reached Istanbul, and Istanbul did something with it that changed the world. It built rooms for it. The coffee house is, as far as we can tell, an Ottoman invention, a public room open to anyone with a coin, where men who were not related and had no business with each other could sit for hours, drink something that made them alert rather than drowsy, play backgammon, listen to a storyteller, and talk. Governments noticed. Coffee houses were banned in Istanbul more than once, precisely because a room full of alert men talking freely about whatever they liked was correctly understood to be politically interesting. The bans never held. There were too many rooms and too many people who wanted to sit in them. And when coffee moved west into Europe in the 17th century, it moved with the room attached. The London coffee house, the Viennese cafe, the Parisian cafe, All of them are descendants of that Ottoman institution, and a great deal of European intellectual and commercial life happened in them. Insurance markets grew in them, newspapers grew in them, revolutions were discussed in them. I begin there because it is a fair picture of what this empire actually was. We tend to remember it, if we remember it at all in the West, as a military threat at the edge of a map, sieges, cannon, the Turks at the gates of Vienna. And those things happened, and we will get to them properly. But the Ottoman Empire was, for most of its length and for most of the people inside it, something much less dramatic and much more interesting. It was a place where things met, where a Greek word and a Persian word and an Arabic word ended up in the same Turkish sentence, where a Jewish family expelled from Spain settled in Salonika and stayed for 400 years, where a boy born in a Balkan village could end up running the empire. The word people reach for is a bridge, east and west. And that is not wrong, but it is a little lazy because a bridge is a thing you cross and leave. This was somewhere people lived. So here is the question I would like us to carry tonight, and you can hold it very loosely. How does a small band of frontier horsemen with no city, no fleet, no treasury, and no particular claim to anything become a world empire and then hold it together for 600 years across an enormous variety of peoples, languages, and faiths, most of whom are not Turkish and not Muslim? That is a genuinely hard question, and historians are still arguing about the answer. We will look at several of the arguments as we go. But first, we need to understand the world Osman was born into, because it was not empty and it was not calm. Let us go back a little. For a long time, the land we now call Turkey was not Turkish at all. Anatolia, the great peninsula between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, was Greek-speaking and Christian, and it had been the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire, the state we usually call Byzantine, for centuries. Its cities were old. Its bishops were old. Its roads were Roman. Then, in the 11th century, Turkic peoples began moving west, out of Central Asia in large numbers. They came in waves over generations as pastoral nomads with herds and horses, pushed and pulled by pressures we can only partly reconstruct. In 1071 at Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, a Seljuk Turkish army defeated a Byzantine army and captured the emperor. The battle itself was not the catastrophe later writers made it, but its consequences were, because the Byzantine state fell into civil war afterwards and simply stopped defending the interior. Over the following 2 centuries, Anatolia changed. Turkish-speaking populations settled across the plateau. A Seljuk Sultanate established itself with its capital at Konya. Many of the local population converted over time, some quickly, many slowly, and a great deal of intermarriage and coexistence went on that later national histories on both sides have preferred not to dwell on. Then came the Mongols. In 1243, at a place called Kosada, a Mongol army destroyed the Seljuk field force, and the Seljuk Sultanate of Anatolia became a tributary state, and then gradually a fiction. By the late 13th century, real power on the Anatolian plateau had fragmented into a scattering of small independent Turkish principalities. The Turkish word for them is beylik. A bey is a chief or lord, and a beylik is what he holds. There were perhaps a dozen or more of them at any given time, each with a few towns, some cavalry, some pasture, and ambitions limited mostly by their neighbors. Some were larger and richer than others. The Karamanids in the south considered themselves the true heirs of the Seljuks, and were treated as the most serious power in Anatolia for a long time. The Aydinids on the west coast had ships and raided the Aegean. Jeremian, Menteşe, Saruhan, Kandar. names that survive now mostly in the memory of specialists. And in the far northwest, on the very edge of that world, closest to what remained of Byzantine territory, there was a small one, smaller than most, poor hilly country, around a town called Söğüt, which means willow tree. Its chief was named Osman. Now I have to be honest with you about something, because this is the point where most tellings of this story quietly slide past a real difficulty. We know very little about Osman. The empire that grew from him would eventually keep some of the most extensive archives of any pre-modern state on earth. Millions of documents, tax registers, court records, imperial decrees, payroll books. But almost none of that begins before the 15th century. The earliest Ottoman written histories we have were composed roughly 150 years after Osman's lifetime, by writers with an obvious interest in making the founder's story look like the beginning of something inevitable. For the man himself, we have a handful of Byzantine references, some coins, one endowment document of contested authenticity, and a great deal of later tradition. One British historian surveying the situation described early Ottoman history as effectively a black hole. That is stronger than most would put it, but the difficulty is real, and I would rather you knew about it than believed a tidy story. Here is what the tradition holds. Osman was the son of a chief named Ertuğrul, who had brought his people into that corner of Anatolia and been granted or had taken land there. Osman succeeded him around the turn of the 14th century, and the date usually given for the founding of the Ottoman state is 1299. Why that year? There is no famous battle attached to it, no declaration, no coronation we can point to. One rather elegant suggestion is that 1299 in the Christian calendar corresponds to the turn of the year 700 in the Islamic calendar. By coincidence, the two centuries turned at almost the same moment. For an empire that would eventually straddle both worlds, later chroniclers could hardly have chosen a more satisfying date, and there is a reasonable suspicion that this is exactly why they chose it. The one event in Osman's career that we can date with some confidence from an outside source is a small battle at a place called Baphius, near Nicomedia in 1302, where his forces beat a Byzantine detachment. It was not large. It mattered because it made him visible. Then there is the dream. In the traditional account, the young Osman spends a night in the house of a holy man and dreams that a moon rises from the holy man's chest and enters his own. And from his body a great tree grows, and the tree's shade covers the world, and rivers run from its roots, and cities and gardens flourish beneath its branches. He wakes and tells the holy man, who explains that God has given sovereignty to Osman and his descendants, and gives him his daughter in marriage. That story appears in the written record roughly a century and a half after it supposedly happened. It is a foundation legend, and it does what foundation legends do. It should not be mistaken for a record of anyone's night. But it is worth keeping, because it tells you what the Ottomans wanted to say about themselves. Not that they had conquered, but that they had been given something, and that what they had been given was shade and water and cities, a tree, not a sword. Now, what actually made this particular Beylik grow when the others did not? This is one of the genuine arguments in the field, and I would like to lay out both sides fairly, because it matters for how you understand everything that follows. The older explanation associated with the historian Paul Wittek, writing in the 1930s, is called the Gaza thesis. Gaza means raiding or striving in the path of the faith, and a Ghazi is one who does it. Wittek argued that the frontier principalities, and the Ottomans above all, were driven by a religious ideology of holy war against the Christian frontier and that this gave them a motivating energy their inland rivals lacked. The Ottomans were closest to Byzantine land, so the Ottomans attracted the most fighters and grew fastest. For decades, that was the standard answer. Then it came under heavy criticism from Colin Imber, Heath Lowry, Samal Kafadar, and others, and the criticism runs roughly like this. The sources describing an Ottoman Gaza ethos are late, written when the state had become a formal Islamic empire that needed that self-image. The behavior of the early Ottomans looks much less doctrinaire than the label suggests. They allied with Christian lords. Christian warriors fought in their forces, some of them prominently, and there is real doubt about whether all of them converted. They married into Byzantine and Balkan families. They took over Byzantine soldiers and Byzantine practices wholesale. Kafadar's contribution, which many find the most satisfying, is that Gaza in the 14th century frontier did not mean what it meant in a 15th century religious treatise. On that frontier, it was a warrior ethos, loose, inclusive, more about honor and booty and a shared way of life than about theology. And it could accommodate people who prayed differently, something closer to a border culture than a crusade. So what made the Ottomans grow? Probably a combination that has nothing very mystical about it. Location first. They sat on the frontier with a weakening Byzantine state, so there was somewhere to expand into that would not immediately unite the other beyliks against them. Openness second. They absorbed anyone useful regardless of origin, and the people they absorbed brought skills, especially in siege warfare and administration and eventually seafaring. Luck, third, and a very long run of it in the form of an unusual sequence of capable rulers. And one more thing, which is easy to miss and might be the most important of all. They were consistently better at incorporating than at destroying. A defeated Byzantine lord who submitted often kept his land, and his son sometimes ended up in Ottoman service. That made submitting a reasonable option rather than a catastrophe, and every time someone chose it, the Ottomans grew without a fight. Osman died around 1323 or 1324, having taken no great city. His son Orhan took one immediately. In 1326, after a long blockade rather than a storm, the city of Bursa fell. It lies at the foot of a mountain in northwestern Anatolia, green and well-watered with hot springs, and it became the Ottomans' first real capital. Osman's tomb is there. So is Orhan's and those of several who followed. Bursa mattered for more than prestige. A city means markets and taxes on markets and craftsmen and a mint and a place to keep records. It is the moment a warband starts becoming a state. Nicaea fell a few years later and Nicomedia after it, and by the mid-30s the Byzantines had effectively lost Anatolia. Then, in the 1340s and 50s, came the step that changed everything. The Byzantine Empire fell into a civil war, as it did with some regularity, and one of the claimants, John Cantacuzenus, invited Orhan to bring troops across the straits to help him. Orhan did. He was also given the claimant's daughter, Theodora, in marriage. Read that twice. A Byzantine emperor's daughter married to the Turkish chief, and Turkish troops in Europe as allies of one Byzantine faction against another. The frontier was never a clean line between civilizations. It was a place where everyone used everyone. In 1354, an earthquake struck the Gallipoli Peninsula on the European shore of the Dardanelles and badly damaged the fortifications of the town of Gallipoli. Ottoman forces already in the area occupied it and did not leave. That is the moment the Ottomans became a European power, and it happened because of a tremor in the ground. From Gallipoli they moved north and west into Thrace, In 1369, they took Edirne, the city the Greeks called Adrianople, on the road to the Balkans, and in time made it their capital. And here something surprising happens, which almost everyone gets wrong. For most of the next century, the Ottoman center of gravity was in Europe, not Asia. The Balkans were richer in silver and manpower than the Anatolian plateau. The bulk of Ottoman revenue and much of the army came from there. Edirne in Europe was the capital. When later Ottoman sultans wanted to describe their realm, the European provinces were called Rumeli, the land of the Romans, and the Anatolian ones simply Anadolu, and Rumeli came first. The empire's expansion into the Balkans was not a single conquest either. It was decades of raiding, of local lords submitting and becoming vassals, of Ottoman intervention in Serbian and Bulgarian and Bosnian quarrels at the invitation of one side or the other. Under Murad I, who ruled from 1362, the state took a firmer shape, and it is in his reign that we reach the battle that has echoed longest. On the 15th of June, 1389, on a plain in Kosovo, an Ottoman army met a coalition led by the Serbian prince Lazar. Both leaders died. Murad was killed on the field in circumstances the sources describe differently, and Lazar was captured and executed. The battle itself was probably close to a draw in immediate military terms, and Serbian resistance did not end that day. But the Serbian state that emerged afterwards did so as an Ottoman vassal, and within decades Ottoman authority in the region was settled. What Kosovo became over the following centuries is something much larger than what it was. It grew into the central story of Serbian national memory, retold in epic poetry, a tale of a prince choosing a heavenly kingdom over an earthly one of martyrdom and betrayal. That memory was still being invoked in the politics of the 1980s and 90s, 600 years later, with terrible consequences. I mention that not to take a side in it, and I will not, but because it is one of the clearest examples of something we should keep in view all night. What happens is one thing. What a people later needs the event to have meant is another, and the second frequently outlives and outweighs the first. Murad's son Bayezid took the throne on the field at Kosovo. They called him Yildirim the Thunderbolt, for the speed with which he moved armies. He needed it. He fought in the Balkans and Anatolia almost simultaneously, absorbing rival beyliks in the east, while pressing Byzantine territory in the west. In 1396, at Nicopolis on the Danube, he destroyed a large crusading army drawn from across Europe, and after that there was no serious Western attempt to push the Ottomans back for a very long time. By the end of the century, he had Constantinople itself under intermittent blockade, and it looked as though the city might fall to him. Then from the east came Timur. Timur, whom Europeans called Tamerlane, was a Turco-Mongol conqueror out of Central Asia who had spent 30 years assembling an empire from a base at Samarkand, and who regarded the western Anatolian beyliks Bayezid had swallowed as properly within his sphere. In July 1402, near Ankara, the two armies met. Bayezid lost decisively, partly because contingents from the beyliks he had annexed changed sides during the battle when they recognized their old lords in Timur's force. Bayezid was captured. He died in captivity the following year. Later European drama made much of the story that he was carried about in a cage, which may or may not be true, and which the earliest sources do not support. And the Ottoman state, which had looked a decade earlier as though it might swallow Constantinople and then the Balkans entire, simply came apart. Timur restored the beyliks Bayezid had absorbed, took what he wanted, and went home to plan an invasion of China, dying on the way. He was not interested in governing Anatolia. He was interested in demonstrating that he could break whoever he liked. What he left behind was 11 years the Ottomans called the Fetret Devri, the interregnum. Bayezid's sons fought each other for the throne, with different sons controlling different parts of the realm and courting different allies: Byzantine, Serbian, Anatolian. Now here is the interesting thing, and it is a real puzzle. The state should have died. Almost every comparable polity in that position did. The dynasty was humiliated, the founders' conquests were reversed, the sons were at each other's throats, and every neighbor had every incentive to finish the job. It did not die. In 1413, Mehmed I emerged as sole ruler and put the pieces back together, and within a generation, the empire was stronger than before. Why? Historians point to a few things. The administrative machinery in the Balkans kept functioning through the whole crisis, collecting taxes and running provinces, because the local Christian lords and the Ottoman provincial cavalry had come to depend on it and had no better option. The rival sons all wanted to inherit that machinery intact rather than wreck it. And the Byzantines and Balkan states, who might have combined to destroy the Ottomans, were themselves too divided and exhausted to do it. A state, once it exists and people's livelihoods run through it, is a surprisingly hard thing to kill. Mehmed I ruled until 1421, rebuilding. His son Murad II ruled, with one strange interruption, until 1451. Murad II is one of the more sympathetic figures in the whole dynasty and one of the odder. He was a competent soldier who fought a long war in the Balkans, defeated a crusading army at Varna on the Black Sea coast in 1444, and consolidated the empire's position thoroughly. He also twice tried to stop. In 1484, he abdicated in favor of his 12-year-old son and retired to Manisa, apparently genuinely wanting a quiet life among poets and Sufis. The crisis that followed brought him back. He abdicated again a few years later and was brought back again. He seems to have been a man who found the throne a burden and was not permitted to put it down. His son, restored to the throne on his father's death in 1451, felt no such ambivalence. Mehmed II was 19. The court, which had watched him fumble his first brief reign as a boy, expected very little. The Grand Vizier, Chanderle Halil, an experienced man from an established family, had opposed his previous elevation and evidently thought he could manage him. Mehmed had one objective and had had it, by all accounts, since childhood. Let us slow down for a moment because we have arrived at the hinge of the whole story, and it deserves a little space. Constantinople in 1453 was not what its name suggested. Founded by the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century as the New Rome, it had been for 1,000 years the largest and richest Christian city in the world, the seat of emperors, the guardian of relics and libraries, ringed by the most formidable land walls ever built. By 1453 it was a shell. The empire it ruled had shrunk to the city itself, a few Aegean islands, and a separate holding in southern Greece. The population, which may once have approached 500,000, had fallen to perhaps 50,000, possibly fewer. Whole districts inside the walls had reverted to fields and orchards and vineyards. It was a city with room for a metropolis and the population of a large town, and its walls enclosed a great deal of empty ground. It had been sacked once already, and not by Muslims. In 1204, a crusading army from Western Europe, diverted from its purpose by Venetian interests and Byzantine politics, had taken and looted the city with a thoroughness it never recovered from. Much of the bronze and gold and relic work of 1,000 years went west. Some of it is on public display in Venice today. The bitterness that event left between Eastern and Western Christianity is a large part of why no serious Western relief force came in 1453, but the walls still stood. The Theodosian land walls ran for about 6.5 kilometers across the landward side of the peninsula. They were a layered system, a moat, then a low outer wall, then a terrace, then the great inner wall, 12 meters high and 5 thick, studded with towers. For 1,000 years they had turned back every attacker who tried them, and the list of those who tried is long. Mehmed's answer was artillery. Gunpowder cannon were not new in 1453. They had been used in European and Ottoman warfare for decades. What was new was the scale of the commitment and the size of the pieces. A Hungarian founder named Orban offered his services to the Byzantine emperor first and could not be paid. He went to Mehmed, who could pay, and asked whether he could cast a gun capable of breaking the walls of Constantinople. He was told to build it. The largest of the guns cast was enormous, its barrel over 8 meters long, throwing a stone ball, weighing something in the region of 500 kilograms. It needed a team of dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to move it, and it could be fired only a handful of times a day, and it had to be cooled with oil between shots, and it eventually cracked. It did not need to be efficient. It needed to be sufficient. Before that, Mehmed had done something quieter and cleverer. In 1452, he built a fortress on the European bank of the Bosphorus, at its narrowest point, opposite a fortress his great-grandfather had built on the Asian side. He built it in about 4 months. Together, the two forts could close the strait, cutting Constantinople off from the Black Sea grain that fed it. The Turkish name for the new one means the throat cutter, and it is still standing. The siege began in early April 1453. Inside were perhaps 7,000 defenders, including a contingent of Genoese under a professional soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani, defending walls designed for many times that number. Outside were somewhere in the region of 80,000, though the ancient habit of exaggeration applies here as everywhere, and the true figure is debated. The emperor was Constantine XI, Palaiologos, and by every account he conducted himself well in an impossible position. The defenders had one great advantage besides the walls. A heavy iron chain, floated on wooden booms, sealed the mouth of the Golden Horn, the deep inlet along the city's northern flank, keeping the Ottoman fleet out and leaving that stretch of wall relatively safe. Mehmed's response to the chain has passed into legend, and it appears to be substantially true. Unable to break it, he had a greased wooden roadway laid over the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and had a number of ships dragged overland out of the Bosphorus, across the ridge, and down into the Golden Horn behind the chain. Imagine watching that from the walls. Ships appearing on a hillside where no water is. The siege lasted 53 days. The great guns worked at the walls, and the defenders repaired them each night with rubble and timber and earth, and for weeks it was not clear who would exhaust the other first. In the early hours of the 29th of May, 1453, after a long bombardment, the final assault came in waves. Giustiniani was wounded and carried from the walls, and his departure damaged morale badly. A gate appears to have been left open or forced. Ottoman troops got onto the walls in numbers, and once that happened, the outcome was fixed. Constantine XI died somewhere in the fighting. His body was never identified with certainty, which is part of why he passed almost immediately into legend as a sleeping emperor waiting to return. What followed was 3 days of sack, permitted by the custom of the time to a city taken by storm rather than surrender. I am not going to describe it because this is a channel for sleeping and because the details add nothing you need. It was what the sack of a great city always was, and thousands of the surviving inhabitants were enslaved. Mehmed entered the city and rode to the church of Hagia Sophia. He was 21 years old, and he had just done what Arab armies, Bulgarian khans, Rus fleets, and his own great-grandfather had all failed to do. Hagia Sophia was itself over 900 years old at that point, built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, with a dome that seemed to contemporaries to hang from heaven rather than rest on anything. Mehmed ordered it converted into a mosque, and it remained one for nearly 500 years and became a museum in the 20th century and was returned to use as a mosque in 2020. He also took a title. Among the many he used, and he used many, he claimed Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. That was not idle. In his own understanding and in the understanding of a good many people at the time, he had not destroyed the Roman Empire. He had inherited it. There had been an emperor in that city for 1100 years, and now he was the emperor, and the fact that he prayed differently did not, to his mind, change what the throne was. That claim is one of the reasons the Ottomans behaved as they did afterwards. They were not a raiding confederation anymore. They were a universal empire with a Roman inheritance and an Islamic one, and they meant to govern like it. The first thing Mehmed did with his new capital was fill it. A city of 50,000 was no use to him. He wanted the greatest city in the world, and he set about manufacturing one. People were resettled into Istanbul from all over the empire, sometimes by invitation and incentive, sometimes by compulsion. Merchants, craftsmen, builders, whole communities moved by decree from Anatolian and Balkan towns. Greeks who had fled were encouraged to return, and many did. Mehmed personally appointed a new Greek Orthodox patriarch, Gennadios, and gave him a formal position with authority over the Orthodox population. Now think about how strange that is on its surface. The conqueror of the Christian capital immediately reinstalls the Christian church. But it is not strange at all once you see the logic. The empire now contained enormous numbers of Christians and Jews, and would soon contain more. It needed them to be governable, taxable, and quiet. Islamic law already provided a framework for tolerated non-Muslim monotheist communities who paid a specific tax and in exchange practiced their religion and ran their own internal affairs under their own religious leaders. The Ottomans built on that framework, and over the centuries, it developed into what is usually called the millet system, from a word meaning a religious community. Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, and Jews each had a recognized community with a recognized head, responsible for their own religious law, their own courts on matters of marriage and inheritance, their own schools, and for delivering their taxes. Two honest qualifications. First, this was not equality. Non-Muslims paid a tax. Muslims did not. Faced restrictions on dress, on building and repairing places of worship, on riding horses in some places and periods, and their testimony was weighted differently in Islamic courts. It was a hierarchy, plainly, and everyone in it knew where they stood. Second, the neat codified system described in textbooks is largely a 19th century formalization, projected backwards. For most of Ottoman history, the arrangements were more ad hoc, varying by place and period, and negotiated case by case. But measured against what was happening elsewhere at the same time, it was remarkable. There is a further layer to Ottoman religious life that the formal picture of mosques and courts and community heads leaves out entirely, and without it the empire is hard to understand. Alongside the official religious establishment ran the Sufi orders. Sufism is the mystical strand of Islam, concerned less with law than with the direct experience of God, and it was organized into orders, each tracing a chain of spiritual teachers back through the centuries, each with its own practices and its own lodges. Those lodges were everywhere. A town might have a grand mosque and a court, and also 3 or 4 lodges, and for a great many people the lodge was where religion actually happened. The best known outside the region is the Mevlevi order, which grew from the teachings of Jalal al-Din Rumi, the 13th century poet who lived and died at Konya in Anatolia, and whose verse, written in Persian, is still among the most widely read poetry on earth. The Mevlevi ceremony involves a slow-turning dance, one hand raised and one lowered, performed to reed, flute, and drum, and it is a form of prayer rather than a performance. The dervishes of the popular imagination are these. Another order, the Bektashi, was closely bound to the Janissary corps, which regarded a Bektashi saint as its patron. That order was loose in its practice, tolerant of local custom, popular in the Balkans and among rural Anatolians, and it absorbed a great deal that stricter jurists disapproved of. The importance of all this is that religion at ground level in the empire was much less tidy than the formal categories suggest. Shrines of local holy figures were visited by Muslims and Christians alike. People sought cures and made vows at the same tombs, regardless of what they were called. Conversion, where it happened, was usually gradual and generational rather than sudden, and often ran through exactly these blurred spaces where the boundaries were softest. The map of who was Muslim and who was not across the Balkans and Anatolia was made slowly over centuries, mostly by people making ordinary decisions about marriage, taxes, and belonging, not by decree. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews from Spain. Tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews were given a choice between conversion and exile. Sultan Bayezid II sent ships. Ottoman vessels carried Jewish refugees east, and they were settled in Istanbul, in Salonika, in Izmir, in Safed. Salonika in particular became a majority Jewish city and remained one for centuries, with Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish language, spoken in its streets 400 years after the expulsion. There is a remark attributed to Bayezid, wondering how Ferdinand could be called wise when he had impoverished his own kingdom and enriched another. Whether he said it or not, it captures the calculation exactly. Skilled populations are an asset, and a ruler who drives them out is doing his rival a favor. Mehmed also built. He laid out a new palace on the point of land where the Golden Horn meets the Bosphorus, meets the Sea of Marmara, one of the great sights on earth, and it grew over centuries into the complex called Topkapi. Topkapi is not a palace in the European sense. There is no single vast building with a grand staircase. It is a sequence of courtyards, each more restricted than the last, with pavilions and gardens and service buildings scattered through them. And the effect is less like Versailles and more like a walled town that gets quieter as you go in. The first court was effectively public. The second held the council chamber and the enormous kitchens, which at their height fed several thousand people a day. The third was the Sultan's own household and the palace school. Beyond that lay the private apartments and the harem. That last word needs unpicking, because in English it carries 2 centuries of European fantasy attached to it. Harem simply means forbidden or private, and it refers to the private family quarters of a household, the part outsiders do not enter. Ordinary Ottoman houses had one. The imperial harem was that, on an imperial scale, the residence of the sultan's mother, his consorts, his children, his sisters, and a large staff of women who ran the whole establishment. It was above all a political institution. The most powerful person in it was usually not a consort, but the Valid Sultan, the sultan's mother, who commanded enormous revenues, patronized major building projects, and could exercise real influence over appointments and policy. European travelers who could not enter it wrote about it anyway, at length, and what they produced tells you a great deal about Europe and very little about Istanbul. Mehmed died in 1481, aged 49, still campaigning. His son Bayezid II ruled for 30 years in a quieter register, consolidating. Then, in 1512, came Selim I, and the empire's center of gravity swung east. Selim's reign lasted only 8 years, and in those 8 years, the empire roughly doubled. His first problem was not Christian Europe at all. It was a new power in Iran. The Safavid dynasty had taken control of Persia at the start of the century under a young and charismatic ruler named Ismail, and had made Twelver Shia Islam the state religion there. That was a religious and political challenge simultaneously, because Ismail's appeal reached deep into eastern Anatolia among Turkmen tribal groups whose loyalty the Ottomans could not take for granted. In 1514, at Chaldiran in eastern Anatolia, the two armies met. The Ottomans had firearms and field artillery in quantity. The Safavids relied on superb cavalry and had neither. The result was decisive, and it set a frontier between the two states that has never entirely gone away. The border between Turkey and Iran today runs not far from where that conflict settled it. It also hardened a sectarian division across the whole region, one whose consequences are still audible in the news. Selim then turned south against the Mamluk Sultanate, which had ruled Egypt and Syria for 2.5 centuries with an army of elite slave soldier cavalry that had once turned back the Mongols. At Marj Dabik in northern Syria in 1516 and at Ridania near Cairo in 1517, the Mamluks were destroyed. Their cavalry was magnificent and largely obsolete. Ottoman handguns and artillery decided both battles. With that, the Ottomans held Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, and the ports of the Red Sea, and crucially, they held the guardianship of the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the most prestigious responsibility in the Sunni Muslim world. The Ottoman Sultan was now, in addition to everything else, the protector of the pilgrimage. Later Ottoman rulers would also claim the title of Caliph, successor to the Prophet's political authority, and the claim was pressed hardest much later in the 19th century, when the empire needed the moral weight of it. Selim died in 1520, aged around 50, of an infection. His nickname in Turkish is Yavuz, which is usually rendered as the grim or the stern, and might be better caught by something like the unyielding. He left his only surviving son an empire that ran from Hungary's border to Yemen, from Algiers to the Caucasus, with a full treasury, a professional army, and no serious rival in the eastern Mediterranean. That son was Suleiman. Let us take this part slowly, because it is the summit. Suleiman came to the throne in 1520, aged 25, and ruled for 46 years, the longest reign of any Ottoman sultan. In Europe, he is Suleiman the Magnificent. In Turkish, he is Kanuni, the lawgiver, and the difference between those two names is the difference between how a state looks from outside and how it feels from inside. The conquests came first and quickly. Belgrade fell in 1521, opening the road up the Danube. Rhodes fell in 1522, removing the Knights of St. John, whose galleys had preyed on Ottoman shipping for 2 centuries. The knights were allowed to leave under terms and eventually settled on Malta, where they would be heard from again. In 1526, at Mohacs, in southern Hungary, an Ottoman army destroyed the Hungarian one in something under 2 hours. The young king, Louis II, died in the retreat, drowned in a stream. Hungary, one of the great kingdoms of Central Europe, effectively ceased to exist as an independent state, and its territory was contested and partitioned for the next century and a half. And in 1529, Ottoman forces reached the walls of Vienna. The siege failed. It failed for reasons that had a great deal to do with logistics and weather, and rather less with heroism on either side. The campaign season in Central Europe is short. Vienna is roughly 1,000 miles from Istanbul by the roads of the time. Heavy siege artillery could not be dragged that far through a wet autumn, so the guns that arrived were light ones. Rain, disease, and the approach of winter did the rest, and the army withdrew. That is the high water mark of Ottoman expansion into Europe, and it is worth sitting with what it means. The limit was not a wall or a battle. It was distance divided by the length of a summer. At sea, the same expansion ran outward under a remarkable commander. Hayreddin, called Barbarossa in Europe, had begun as a corsair, operating out of North Africa, and ended as admiral of the Ottoman fleet. Under him, the empire took control of much of the North African coast, and, for a period in the mid-16th century, the central Mediterranean itself. In 1538, he beat a large combined Christian fleet at Preveza off the Greek coast. For a few decades, the Mediterranean was effectively an Ottoman sea. Now the other name, the lawgiver. Ottoman law had 2 strands, and understanding how they fitted together tells you most of what you need to know about how the empire was actually governed. The first strand was Sharia, Islamic religious law derived from scripture and prophetic tradition and centuries of jurisprudence. It governed matters of worship, family, inheritance, and much of personal conduct, and it was administered by trained judges, called cadis, who sat in courts in every town. The second strand was Kanun, secular law issued by the sultan's own authority. It covered the areas religious law did not reach in detail: land tenure, taxation rates, the administration of provinces, criminal penalties, market regulation, the duties of officials. Suleiman's contribution was to have the accumulated canon of his predecessors systematically reviewed, reconciled, cleaned of contradictions, and codified. That is why they call him the lawgiver. He did not invent a legal system. He made the one that existed coherent and made sure it was written down and applied consistently across an enormous territory. Working alongside him for much of this was Ebu Suud Effendi, the chief religious authority of the empire, whose great achievement was to demonstrate that the sultan's secular law could be squared with religious law rather than competing with it. That reconciliation gave the whole structure a legitimacy it might otherwise have lacked, and the courts were used. This is one of the things the archives show beautifully. Ottoman court records survive in quantity from the 16th century onward, and they are full of ordinary life. Disputes over walls and water, inheritance quarrels, complaints about a butcher's weights. They also show something that surprises people. Women appear in those records constantly, as plaintiffs, as property owners, as parties to contracts, suing over dowries and inheritances and business debts, frequently and often successfully. Non-Muslims appear in them too, sometimes bringing cases to the Qadi's court by preference, even when they had their own community courts available, presumably because they judged it would serve them better. That is not a picture of a lawless despotism. It is a picture of a functioning legal order that people used because they expected it to work. Suleiman's reign also gave the empire its architect. Mimar Sinan was born a Christian in Anatolia, taken into imperial service through the child levy we will come to shortly, trained as a military engineer, and spent decades building bridges and fortifications on campaign before being appointed chief imperial architect in his 40s. He held the post for around 50 years and died in his 90s. The number of works attributed to him and his office runs into the hundreds. Mosques, bridges, aqueducts, baths, hospitals, soup kitchens, caravanserais. His central problem across a whole career was the dome. Hagia Sophia had been sitting in Istanbul for 1,000 years, and it set a standard that Ottoman architects had been measuring themselves against ever since. Sinan's work is a long, patient conversation with that building. He wanted a single great dome over a unified open space with the supports handled so cleanly that the interior felt like one room rather than a series of compartments. The Suleymaniye Mosque, completed in Istanbul in the 1550s, is the great statement of his maturity, rising over the city on its hill, with a cascade of half-domes stepping down from the central one. But he considered his masterpiece to be the Selimiye, built at Edirne and completed in 1575 when he was around 85. There the dome sits on 8 piers, arranged so ingeniously that they seem to vanish into the walls, and the interior is a single enormous volume of light, and its diameter exceeds that of Hagia Sophia by a small margin, which was almost certainly the point. He is buried in a modest tomb of his own design at the corner of the Suleymaniye complex, beside a small fountain. And then there is Hurrem. She was born probably in what is now western Ukraine, in a Ruthenian family, and taken in a slave raid as a girl. She entered the imperial harem. In Europe, she became known as Roxolana, the Ruthenian. What she did afterwards broke essentially every convention of the institution she'd entered. Ottoman practice at that point had settled into a pattern. A consort bore the sultan one son, and thereafter her role was to raise and advance that son, accompanying him to a provincial governorship when he was old enough. The relationship with the sultan did not continue. This spread the dynasty's chances across several mothers and several sons, and kept any one woman from accumulating too much. Suleiman broke it. He had several children with Hurrem. He freed her, and then, extraordinarily, he married her, which sultans of that period simply did not do. And she remained in Istanbul at the center of the court rather than departing to a province. She corresponded with foreign monarchs in her own name. She founded a major charitable complex in Istanbul with a mosque, schools, and a soup kitchen, and another in Jerusalem that fed the poor there for centuries. Some of the letters and poems exchanged between her and Suleiman survive, and they read as the letters of two people genuinely attached to each other. She was also, unavoidably, a political actor in a court where the stakes were life and death. The succession struggles of Suleiman's later years were bitter, and his eldest son by another consort, Mustafa, who was popular with the army, was executed on his father's orders in 1553 on suspicion of plotting. Hurrem's role in the events leading to that has been debated since it happened by contemporaries with agendas and historians with limited evidence, and I am not going to hand you a verdict the sources cannot support. What is clear is that she is the beginning of something structural. For roughly the next century, imperial women, and above all the mothers of sultans, exercised sustained political power at the heart of the empire. Turkish historians sometimes call this period the Sultanate of Women. Suleiman died in 1566, in his 70s, in a tent outside a fortress at Szigetvar in Hungary, in the middle of yet another campaign. The story goes that his grand vizier concealed the death for days so the army would take the fortress and the withdrawal could be managed in order. Let me stop the kings for a while and explain the machine, because we have been describing what the empire did without explaining how it was possible. Two institutions above all. The first is the Timar system, which supplied the cavalry. Most of the empire's agricultural land was, in principle, the sultans. Rather than paying a provincial cavalryman a salary from a central treasury, the state assigned him the right to collect a defined portion of the tax revenue from a defined piece of land. That grant was a timar. In exchange, he lived on that income, maintained his horses and armor, and turned up for campaign each season with a specified number of armed retainers. The grant was not hereditary property. It was conditional, revocable, and tied to service, and the state kept detailed registers of every one of them, village by village, which is why we have such extraordinary Ottoman tax records. The peasants on the land were not serfs. They had legally protected rights of tenure that passed to their heirs so long as they kept cultivating. And they could take the cavalrymen to court, and sometimes did. That system gave the empire tens of thousands of cavalry at almost no cost to the treasury. It also, quietly, gave it a comprehensive census of its own productive capacity. The second institution is harder for modern ears, and I want to describe it accurately rather than gently. It was called the Dev Shirme. The word means collection or gathering. Periodically, officials went into Christian villages, largely in the Balkans and later parts of Anatolia, and took boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, chosen for physique and aptitude in some proportion of households. The boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, taught Turkish, and entered into imperial service. Most became soldiers, forming the janissary corps, the empire's professional standing infantry, salaried, barracked, drilled, and armed with firearms earlier and more systematically than most European armies of the period. The most promising were sent instead to the palace school in Topkapi, where they received an education in languages, law, calligraphy, mathematics, horsemanship, and administration that was probably the finest available anywhere in the region. From that school came the empire's governors, admirals, treasurers, and grand viziers. The architect Sinan came in through this system. So did a great many of the men who ran the empire at its height. It has been calculated that a large majority of Ottoman grand viziers over a long stretch of the empire's history were of Christian birth, brought into service as children. Now, how do we hold this? It was, plainly, a form of enslavement. Children were taken from parents who did not consent and could not refuse, and their family's grief is recorded. There are accounts of villages hiding boys, marrying them off early because married men were exempt, or maiming them so they would be rejected. It was also and simultaneously the most reliable route to power in the entire empire, and there are equally well-documented cases of families trying to get their sons included, and of Muslim families who were not eligible seeking ways in. A boy taken from a village in Bosnia might realistically end up commanding armies and marrying a princess. Both of those things were true at once, and the discomfort of holding them together is not a reason to drop one of them. The strategic logic behind it is cold and clear. The Sultan's ministers and soldiers were his own household slaves, with no clan, no landed family, no regional power base, and no inheritance to protect. Everything they had came from him and returned to him. They could therefore be trusted in a way that a great Turkish noble family, with lands and cousins and ambitions of its own, could not. The system worked as long as that logic held. Later, as we will see, it stopped holding, and the results were serious. Now let me set you down inside all of this because we have been up too high for too long. It is a morning in the 1560s. You live in Istanbul, in a neighborhood on one of the city's hills. You wake before dawn to the call to prayer carried across the rooftops from more directions than you can count, each voice starting a moment after the last so that the sound arrives in overlapping waves. Your house is wood, 2 stories, with an upper floor that projects out over the street on brackets so that the room is larger than the ground it stands on. The windows have lattice screens. There is a small courtyard with a vine over it and, if you are fortunate, a fountain no bigger than a basin. Everything in this city is wood, which is why this city burns, repeatedly and catastrophically, and why fires are among the most frequently recorded events in its history. You go out into a street that is narrow, unpaved, and steep, and that follows no plan whatever, because it grew where people walked. It is not a city of avenues. It is a city of neighborhoods, each with its own small mosque or church or synagogue, its own bakery, its own fountain, its own night watchman. The neighborhood is the real unit of life here. Your neighbors are collectively responsible in law for what happens in it. If a crime occurs and no culprit is found, the neighborhood can be held to account. That gives everyone a strong interest in knowing everyone else's business, which they do thoroughly. Down the hill is the market. The covered bazaar is already enormous by this date, a roofed labyrinth of lanes, each lane belonging to a particular trade, because the guilds are organized that way, and it makes inspection simple. Goldsmiths together, booksellers together, slipper makers together. The guilds run more of daily life than the government does. They set standards, admit apprentices, regulate who may open a shop and where, cap the number of practitioners in a trade, and enforce the officially fixed prices for staple goods. A man who sells short weight can be publicly shamed by his own guild before any official gets involved. And the goods, silk from Bursa and from Iran, wool from Anatolia, coffee arriving from Yemen, spices from the Indian Ocean still coming overland and by the Red Sea despite the Portuguese pushing into that trade around Africa, furs from Russia, woolen cloth from England which the English are keen to sell and the Ottomans mildly interested in buying, grain from Egypt and from the Black Sea, on which the whole city depends absolutely. Feeding Istanbul was the single largest administrative task the empire faced. A city of several 100,000 people cannot feed itself, and the state maintained an elaborate system of provisioning with fixed prices, designated supply regions, and severe consequences for merchants who diverted grain to more profitable markets. When that system failed, the city rioted, and when the city rioted, sultans fell. Water came through aqueducts and into hundreds of public fountains, most of them endowed by wealthy individuals as charitable foundations with the donor's name carved above the spout. That is how much of the city's infrastructure was built and maintained, not by a public works department, but by the pious foundation, the vakuf, in which a wealthy person permanently dedicated the income of a property to some public purpose. Fountains, soup kitchens, hospitals, schools, libraries, bridges, and the upkeep of all of them, in perpetuity. Around midday you might pass a soup kitchen attached to a mosque complex where anyone could eat, and where the great imperial foundations fed hundreds daily, students and travelers and the poor, without question. In the afternoon, the coffee house, a low room, cushioned benches around the walls, small cups, backgammon boards, a haze of pipe smoke, and conversation. Perhaps a storyteller working through an episode of a long tale everyone has heard before, or a shadow puppet performance, the two central characters of which are a blunt, uneducated man and a pretentious, educated one, and the humor of which is broad, topical, and frequently rude about people in authority. And out on the water, all day, every day, the caiques, narrow rowing boats, crossing between the city's shores, because there are no bridges over the Golden Horn worth speaking of, and none at all over the Bosphorus, and everybody who needs to cross pays a boatman, thousands of them. That is the empire at its height for a city dweller. Crowded, loud, wooden, commercial, watched over by neighbors, organized by guilds, fed by a bureaucracy, and endlessly, constantly mixed. Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Ladino, Arabic, Albanian, Italian, all in the same market lane. Out in the countryside, life was slower and harder, and much more like peasant life anywhere. Grain, olives, or vines, depending on the region. A heavy tax burden, and the cavalryman, who collected part of it living nearby in a house not enormously grander than your own. Hold that picture. But before we watch it change, let me show you what these people made, because the Ottomans have an odd reputation for having produced soldiers and buildings and not much else, and it is simply not accurate. Start with a map. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis drew a world map on gazelle skin. Only a fragment survives, and what survives shows the Atlantic, the coast of Western Africa, and opposite it, the coast of South America, with the Caribbean sketched in. He noted on it that he had used a large number of older charts, including, he said, one that had belonged to Columbus. Think about the date. 21 years after Columbus's first voyage, a naval officer in Istanbul had assembled the best available intelligence about a hemisphere no one in his world had visited, and drawn it. He later produced a book of navigation covering the Mediterranean coast in extraordinary detail, harbor by harbor, with charts and sailing directions. Then there is Katip Chalabi, working in the 17th century, who compiled a bibliography of essentially everything he could establish had been written in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, running to many thousands of titles with notes on each. He also wrote geography, history, and a treatise arguing that the religious controversies consuming his contemporaries were mostly not worth the energy. And Evliya Çelebi, my favorite of them, who spent about 40 years traveling the empire and beyond, and wrote it all down in 10 volumes. His book is one of the great oddities of world literature. He describes cities, guilds, buildings, foods, local accents, jokes, and the exact price of things. He records how people spoke, which almost nobody in that era bothered to do. He is also cheerfully and frequently unreliable, prone to enormous exaggeration, and to including marvels he cannot possibly have seen. And part of the pleasure of reading him is that you can feel him enjoying himself. Historians use him constantly and check him constantly. There was an observatory, too, built in Istanbul in the 1570s by an astronomer named Taqi al-Din, comparable to the best in Europe at that moment. It was demolished 3 years later after a comet appeared and its interpretation went badly wrong politically. Scientific institutions are fragile things everywhere, and that one broke. In the arts, the empire produced a tradition of manuscript painting of real refinement, illustrating history's festival books and biographies in flat, brilliant color with a great deal of precisely observed detail about ceremonies and crowds. And above all, there was poetry. Ottoman court poetry, divan poetry, is a formal tradition drawing on Persian models, dense with conventional images, the rose and the nightingale, the beloved's face, the wine cup, the moth and the candle. To modern ears trained on originality, it can seem repetitive until you understand that the whole point was to do something new inside a fixed set of moves, the way a jazz musician works a standard. Sultans wrote it themselves, seriously and under pen names, Suleiman among them. Alongside it ran a completely different folk tradition, sung, plain-spoken, accompanied on a long-necked lute, dealing in love and injustice and exile, and that tradition is still alive. Now we can watch it change. Now, the next 300 years, there is an old story about what happened to the Ottoman Empire after Suleiman, and the old story is wrong, and it is worth saying why before we go on. The old story is decline. It says that the empire peaked under Suleiman in the 16th century, and then slid downhill for 350 years, growing weaker, more corrupt, and more backward, until it was finally put out of its misery after the First World War. The phrase "the sick man of Europe," coined in the 19th century, gets applied backwards over the whole period. Historians have spent the last few decades dismantling that account, and the objections are straightforward. An empire in continuous decline for 3.5 centuries is not declining. It is enduring, which is a different thing, and it requires explanation rather than dismissal. The Ottomans, in this supposedly declining period, conquered Crete after one of the longest sieges in history, took Cyprus, held off Habsburg and Russian pressure for generations, reformed their tax system substantially, and continued to govern one of the largest territories on earth with a functioning bureaucracy. And much of the evidence for decline came from Ottoman writers themselves, court advisors who wrote memoranda telling the Sultan that everything had gone wrong since the good old days, and urging a return to the practices of Suleiman's time. Historians took those at face value for a long while. They are better understood as a genre. Every era has men who believe standards have collapsed since their grandfather's day, and their testimony is evidence of anxiety rather than of measurable collapse. The word most historians now prefer is transformation. So let us look at what actually changed, because a great deal did. The first change was that the world's trade routes moved. The Ottomans sat astride the land and Red Sea routes between Asia and Europe and taxed them, and that was a foundation of their wealth. Then the Portuguese rounded Africa, and over the following century, a growing share of the spice trade went by sea around the Cape, and later the Dutch and English took that over and industrialized it. The Ottomans fought back at sea in the Indian Ocean for a while and could not sustain it at that distance. At the same time, enormous quantities of silver from the mines of Spanish America flooded into the Mediterranean economy, and prices across the whole region rose steeply through the later 16th century. For a state whose revenues were largely fixed in cash terms and whose soldiers were paid fixed salaries, sustained inflation is a serious structural problem. The second change was military and financial, and the two are the same change. Warfare in Europe shifted decisively toward large infantry armies with firearms and toward fortifications designed to resist artillery. Cavalry mattered less. The Ottoman Timar cavalry, which had been the empire's great cheap strength, became less useful, and the state needed more paid infantry with guns instead. Paid infantry cost money. So the Janissary Corps grew enormously, from perhaps 10,000 in Suleiman's day to many times that, and to fund it, the state moved away from the Tamar system toward tax farming, in which the right to collect the taxes of a district was auctioned to a bidder who paid up front and kept what he could squeeze. That gave the treasury cash immediately. It also inserted a private profit motive between the state and the taxpayer, and over generations the tax farms became effectively hereditary, and the men holding them became a class of provincial notables with their own local power. The third change was inside the palace, and it began with a solution to a genuinely horrifying problem. Ottoman succession had no rule of primogeniture. Any son could inherit, and the throne went to whoever secured it. To prevent the civil wars this produced, a practice had developed, formalized under Mehmed II, by which a sultan on taking the throne had his brothers put to death. The reasoning was that one death was preferable to a war costing thousands. On one occasion in 1595, it meant 19 brothers, many of them small children. I am not going to dwell on it. It was as appalling as it sounds, and Ottoman society knew it, and it was eventually stopped. What replaced it early in the 17th century was seniority combined with confinement. The throne would pass to the eldest surviving male of the dynasty, usually a brother rather than a son, and the other princes would live confined within the palace in apartments known as the cage. That ended the killing. It also meant that men came to the throne having spent decades sealed inside a set of rooms, without administrative experience, without military command, without ever having governed a province, and in some cases in poor psychological condition. The consequence was that real power drifted away from the person of the sultan and toward other centers: the Grand Vizier's household, the senior religious establishment, the janissary corps, and the imperial harem, particularly the sultan's mother. That last one is worth pausing on again because it is routinely told as decadence and is nothing of the sort. If a sultan comes to the throne as a child, someone must govern. For much of the 17th century, that someone was frequently the Valid Sultan, and several of them were highly capable. Kosum Sultan is the outstanding example, dominating Ottoman politics for something like 30 years. Across the reigns of her husband, 2 sons, and a grandson, managing factions, appointing and dismissing viziers, and endowing extensive charitable works. She died violently in a palace struggle in 1651, which tells you what kind of arena it was. These were not women exercising influence through whispers. They were regents, in fact, if not in title, and they were understood as such at the time. At sea, the 17th century opened with a defeat everyone remembers and a recovery almost nobody does. In 1571, off the western coast of Greece, at Lepanto, a combined Christian fleet under Spanish, Venetian, and Papal command met the Ottoman fleet and destroyed it. It was the last great battle of oared galleys in the Mediterranean, and it was celebrated across Catholic Europe as deliverance. Within about a year, the Ottomans had rebuilt the fleet. The Grand Vizier at the time is reported to have made a remark to a Venetian envoy to the effect that in taking Cyprus, the Ottomans had cut off Venice's arm, while at Lepanto, Venice had merely shaved the Ottoman beard, and a beard grows back. Whether he said it in those words or not, he was right about the strategic reality. Cyprus, taken by the Ottomans just before Lepanto, stayed Ottoman for 3 centuries. Lepanto changed the map not at all. Crete followed later in a siege of the fortress of Candia that ran on and off for 21 years, from 1648 to 1669, and is among the longest sieges recorded anywhere. In the middle of the century, the empire found new energy through a single family. Mehmed Köprülü, an elderly official of Albanian origin, was appointed Grand Vizier in 1656 on the condition, which he insisted on, that he be given genuinely free authority. He used it ruthlessly to restore discipline and finances. His son and later relatives followed him in the office, and the Köprülü period is one of real administrative revival. It also produced the last great westward push. In 1683, a Köprülü Grand Vizier led an enormous army up the Danube and laid siege to Vienna for the second time in 154 years. The siege lasted 2 months. The city held, barely, its walls undermined, and its garrison exhausted. And then in September, a relief army arrived, made up of Habsburg and German forces and a Polish contingent under King Jan Sobieski, and came down off the high ground of the Kallenberg into the Ottoman camp. The Ottoman army broke, and the siege collapsed. This time, unlike 1529, the failure did not end there. A Holy League formed, and the war went on for 16 years, and the Ottomans lost it. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed in 1699, is the genuine hinge of the empire's later history, more than any battle. Under it, the Ottomans surrendered Hungary and Transylvania to the Habsburgs and other territory to Venice and Poland. It was the first time the Ottoman Empire had signed away large territories as a defeated party at a negotiating table. Before that, treaties had been truces granted from strength. After that, the pattern of the next 200 years was set: war, defeat, a conference, a loss of land. Something else about Karlowitz matters. The negotiations were conducted according to European diplomatic conventions, with mediators and a formal congress, and the Ottomans participated as one state among several, rather than as a universal empire granting terms. That was a change in self-understanding as much as in borders. The 18th century that followed is, oddly, one of the more pleasant stretches to read about. It opens with what Turkish historians call the Tulip Era, roughly 1718 to 1730, a period of relative peace under a sultan and a grand vizier who preferred building in gardens to campaigning. Waterside pavilions went up along the Bosphorus. Poetry flourished. And there was a genuine craze for tulips, which were cultivated obsessively, cataloged, and traded at high prices. The tulip, incidentally, is native to Central Asia and Anatolia, and it reached the Netherlands in the 16th century from Ottoman gardens by way of a Habsburg ambassador in Istanbul who sent bulbs home. The Dutch tulip mania of the 1630s and the Ottoman one of the 1720s are branches of the same story. It was also in this period, in 1727, that the first Ottoman Turkish printing press for books was established by a Hungarian convert named Ibrahim Muteffarika. That date raises an obvious question, since Gutenberg had printed in the 1450s. Why so late? The usual answer is religious prohibition, and it is not quite right. Non-Muslim communities in the empire had been printing in Hebrew, Armenian, and Greek since the 15th century without hindrance. What was restricted was printing in Arabic script. The reasons were partly religious sensitivity about the sacred script, and partly, and probably more importantly, economic. There were thousands of professional scribes in the empire, an organized and respected profession, and manuscript production was fast, beautiful, and adequate to demand, a technology that threatens the livelihood of an entire established guild does not get adopted easily anywhere. Muteffarika's press printed dictionaries, histories, geographies, and grammars. It did not print the Quran. It closed after his death, and printing did not become widespread for decades. The Tulip Era ended abruptly in 1730 with a revolt in Istanbul, led by a janissary and joined by artisans, that killed the Grand Vizier and deposed the Sultan. The pavilions were torn down. That revolt is a useful marker of a larger problem. So let us look at the janissaries properly, because their story is the story of the empire in miniature. They had begun as the Sultan's own slave soldiers, celibate in practice, barracked, forbidden to trade, entirely dependent on him. Over the centuries, every one of those conditions eroded. They were permitted to marry. Their sons were permitted to enlist. So the corps became partly hereditary, and the child levy withered away and was effectively finished by the early 18th century. They were permitted to trade in the off-season, and many became shopkeepers and craftsmen, with janissary pay as a supplement. Enrollment papers were bought, sold, and inherited, so that by the 18th century, a large share of those on the payroll had no military function at all. What that produced was not simply a weakened army. It produced a large, armed, organized urban interest group, deeply embedded in the guilds and the markets of Istanbul, with a strong stake in the existing order and a proven ability to depose sultans. Every reforming sultan for a century and a half ran into them. New model troops trained in European drill and equipped with modern muskets were a direct threat to janissary privilege, and the janissaries knew it. Selim III, who came to the throne in 1789, the year the French Revolution began, tried hardest. His program was called the Nizam-e-Shedid, the New Order, a new army trained on European lines, new taxes to pay for it, permanent embassies in European capitals, and translated technical works. In 1807, the janissaries and their allies deposed him. He was killed the following year. His successor, Mahmud II, watched all of this closely. As a young man, and spent the first 17 years of his reign preparing very carefully. In 1826, he moved. He announced a new drilled unit. The janissaries revolted as expected, and this time the Sultan had prepared the ground. He had the senior religious establishment behind him, loyal artillery in position, and public opinion in Istanbul, largely with him after decades of janissary misbehavior. The revolt was crushed with artillery. In the barracks square, the corps was abolished, and its name was struck out. Ottoman history calls it the auspicious incident. It was extremely bloody, and it removed the single largest obstacle to reform in one afternoon. There was a second obstacle, though, and it was not in Istanbul. Over the 18th century, out in the provinces, the shift to tax farming had produced a class of powerful local notables called Ayan. They held tax rights that had become hereditary in practice. They maintained their own armed retainers, and in many regions they were the real government. The center negotiated with them rather than commanding them. In 1808, this reached a point that is genuinely startling for an absolute monarchy. A group of these notables and the new sultan signed a document, sometimes called the Deed of Alliance, in which the sultan acknowledged their standing and they acknowledged his, with mutual obligations set out. Historians occasionally compare it to Magna Carta, which overstates it, and it was a dead letter within a few years. But it happened, and it shows exactly how far power had drifted outward. The most formidable of these provincial figures was in Egypt. Mehmed Ali, usually called Muhammad Ali, was an officer of Albanian origin who had arrived in Egypt with Ottoman forces after the French occupation there collapsed, and who maneuvered his way into being appointed governor in 1805. He then proceeded to build inside an Ottoman province, a state considerably more modern than the empire that nominally owned it. He destroyed the old Mamluk power in Egypt. He seized control of agricultural land and directed it toward cash crops, above all cotton. He built factories, an arsenal, and a shipyard. He created a conscript army trained by European officers, with Egyptian peasants in the ranks, which was the crucial innovation. He sent students to Paris and founded schools of medicine and engineering. Then he used it. His forces took Sudan. They fought for the Sultan against the Greek rebels. And in 1831 he turned on his sovereign and invaded Syria. His army beat the Ottoman army, took Syria, crossed into Anatolia, and in 1832 destroyed another Ottoman force at Konya, leaving the road toward Istanbul effectively open. The Sultan, with nothing left to fight with, appealed to Russia. Russian troops landed on the Bosphorus in 1833 to defend the Ottoman capital from an Ottoman governor, which is one of the strangest sentences in this whole story, and tells you precisely where things stood. It happened again at the end of the decade. In 1839, the Ottoman army was beaten once more at Nizip, and days later the Ottoman fleet sailed to Alexandria and defected to Muhammad Ali en masse. The empire was saved that time not by its own strength, but by the European powers, who decided in 1840 and 1841 that a strong Egypt under an ambitious ruler was more dangerous to the balance of power than a weak Ottoman Empire. They forced Muhammad Ali out of Syria and confined him to Egypt, where his family was granted hereditary rule and remained until 1952. That is the position the empire was now in. It survived because its rivals had not yet agreed on how to divide it, and by 1826 the pressure on the empire was no longer only military, and the deeper problem could not be solved by cannon. The deeper problem was nationalism. Let me slow down here because this is the part that decides everything, and it is more interesting than the battles. The Ottoman Empire was built on a principle that had served it for 400 years. People are organized by faith and by locality. They run their own communities, they pay their taxes, and the state does not ask them to be anything in particular. A Bulgarian Orthodox villager, an Armenian craftsman, a Bosnian Muslim landowner, a Jewish merchant in Salonika, and a Greek shipowner on Chios were all subjects of the same sultan, and nobody expected them to share a language, a religion, or an identity. Nationalism, arriving from Europe from the late 18th century onward, said something completely different. It said that the natural unit of political life is the nation, defined by shared language and culture and history, and that every nation ought to have its own state. For a multi-ethnic empire, that idea is not a challenge. It is a solvent. Serbia rose in revolt in 1804 and won effective autonomy over the following decades. The Greek War of Independence began in 1821, and after a long and brutal struggle on both sides, in which European powers eventually intervened decisively, produced an independent Greek kingdom by 1832. And once the process started, it did not stop. Every decade of the 19th century saw further movements, further revolts, further interventions by the great powers, and further losses. Romania, Bulgaria, Montenegro. In 1878, after another disastrous war with Russia, the empire lost a great swathe of its European territory at once. Each loss was accompanied by movement of people, and this is the part usually left out. Hundreds of thousands and cumulatively millions of Muslims were driven or fled from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea coast into what remained of Ottoman territory across the 19th century. They arrived destitute, in enormous numbers, into a state with no capacity to absorb them, carrying the memory of what had happened to them. That refugee experience is one of the least understood forces in the region's modern history, and it fed directly into the harder and more defensive politics of the empire's final decades. The Ottoman answer to nationalism at first was a bold one. Beginning in 1839 with a decree read out in the Gülhane Park and continuing for nearly 40 years, the empire attempted the reform program known as the Tanzimat, meaning the reorganization. Its central idea was equality. Ottomanism, they called it. The legal distinctions between Muslim and non-Muslim subjects would be abolished. All subjects would have equal rights, equal obligations, equal access to courts and schools and the army, and would be citizens of a shared Ottoman state rather than members of separate religious communities. It was, in principle, an attempt to answer nationalism by manufacturing a new nationality large enough to hold everyone. An enormous amount was actually built: secular courts and new legal codes, a modern state school system, a postal service, a telegraph network and railways, a conscript army, provincial councils with elected members, a civil bureaucracy that grew enormously and became the empire's most dynamic institution. In 1876, the empire adopted a written constitution and elected a parliament with Muslim, Christian, and Jewish deputies sitting together. And it did not work. It did not work partly because of resistance from below. Many conservative Muslims experienced equality as the loss of a status they had held for centuries. Many Christian communities were suspicious of reforms that included conscription and that weakened the community autonomy they had relied on. And by the time equality was offered, many of the empire's Christian populations had already decided they wanted a nation of their own rather than equal citizenship in someone else's empire. It did not work partly because of money. The reforms were enormously expensive, and the empire funded them by borrowing on European markets from the 1850s onward. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, in which Britain and France fought alongside the Ottomans against Russia, accelerated the borrowing sharply. In 1875, the Ottoman state defaulted. What followed in 1881 was the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a body controlled by the European creditors, which was given the direct right to collect certain Ottoman revenues at source, including the taxes on salt, tobacco, silk, spirits, and fisheries. It employed thousands of people. It ran a substantial part of the fiscal system of a sovereign empire on behalf of foreign bondholders. Alongside that ran the capitulations, trade privileges originally granted freely from a position of strength centuries earlier, which by the 19th century had hardened into a system exempting foreign nationals and their local protégés from Ottoman taxes and Ottoman courts, an empire that cannot tax the richest commercial activity within its own borders, cannot set its own tariffs, and does not control its own revenue collection, is sovereign in name. The Constitution of 1876 lasted about 2 years. Sultan Abdulhamid II suspended Parliament in 1878 and ruled personally for 30 years. He is a genuinely contested figure, and I will give you both readings. Against him, he ran an autocracy with extensive censorship and an extensive network of informers, and his reign saw large-scale massacres of Armenians in the mid-1890s, in which very large numbers died. For him, the state building of the Tanzimat continued and in some respects accelerated under him, particularly in education and railways, including the line toward the holy cities in Arabia. He kept a bankrupt and dismembered empire in existence for 3 decades by playing the great powers against one another with considerable skill. And he emphasized the Sultan's role as caliph, appealing to Muslim solidarity across and beyond the empire, in a deliberate attempt to find a new basis for loyalty, now that Ottomanism had failed. Both accounts describe the same man. In 1908, a movement of officers and officials, organized largely in Salonika and known to history as the Young Turks, forced the restoration of the Constitution. The initial mood was extraordinary. There are photographs and accounts of crowds in the streets of Ottoman cities in the summer of 1908, Muslims and Christians and Jews embracing, celebrating liberty and fraternity and an end to arbitrary rule together. For a moment it looked as though the empire might have found its future. The moment was very short. Within a few years, the Committee of Union and Progress, the movement's dominant faction, had become increasingly authoritarian, and after a coup in 1913, the empire was effectively run by a small group of officers, and the losses accelerated. Italy took Libya in 1911 and 1912. Then, in 1912, the Balkan states, briefly united, attacked, and in a few months the empire lost almost all of its remaining European territory, including Salonika, the empire's third city, and the birthplace of many of the men now running it. A second Balkan War recovered a little. In 400 years, the Ottomans had gone from Vienna to holding little more than the hinterland of their own capital in Europe. That catastrophe and the flood of refugees that came with it shifted the leadership's thinking hard. Ottomanism was finished. What replaced it among a significant part of the ruling group was Turkish nationalism, which sought to build a national state out of the remaining core. In November 1914, the empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The war went in several directions at once. At Gallipoli in 1915 and early 1916, Ottoman forces defended the Dardanelles against a large Allied landing and, after months of costly fighting on both sides, forced its withdrawal. That defense was the making of an officer named Mustafa Kemal, and it became the founding story of two nations at the other end of the world, as well as of the one it defended. Elsewhere it went badly. The Caucasus Campaign of the winter of 1914 and 1915 destroyed an Ottoman army in the mountains, largely through cold and disease. British and Arab forces advanced through Mesopotamia and the Levant, and in 1915 the Ottoman government undertook the mass deportation of its Armenian population. I am going to be plain about this and then move on, and I am going to keep it non-graphic because you are trying to sleep. Beginning in the spring of 1915, following arrests of Armenian community leaders in the capital in April and a deportation law passed in May, the Armenian population of Anatolia was removed from its towns and villages and marched south toward the Syrian desert. Enormous numbers died, from killings, from starvation, from exposure, and from disease. Estimates of the dead vary with method and with the period counted. Figures commonly given by historians range from around 600,000 at the lowest to around 1.5 million. Whatever figure is used, the great majority of the Armenian population of Anatolia was gone by the end of the war, and communities that had lived in those places for well over 2,000 years ceased to exist. Assyrian and Greek Orthodox populations suffered severely in the same period. The scholarly consensus among historians and genocide scholars, and the official position of many states, is that these events constitute genocide. The Turkish state rejects that characterization, describing the deaths as the consequence of wartime conditions, disease, famine, and intercommunal violence in a collapsing empire, and disputes the higher casualty figures. That disagreement is a live political matter between governments today. I have given you the record and the state of the argument, and I am not going to linger because there is nothing I could add tonight that would be a kindness at this hour. The empire's war ended with the Armistice of Mudros in October 1918. Allied warships anchored off Istanbul, and the city was occupied. What followed was 4 years, in which the empire formally still existed and had effectively stopped functioning. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, would have partitioned Anatolia itself among the victors and their clients, leaving a small rump state in the interior. It was signed by the Sultan's government in occupied Istanbul, and it was never ratified, and it never took effect, because by the time it was signed, the situation on the ground had already changed. A Greek army had landed at Izmir in 1919 with Allied backing, and its advance inland provoked exactly what the treaty's authors had not anticipated: a national resistance movement organized out of Ankara in the Anatolian interior under Mustafa Kemal. The war that followed ran until 1922 and was fought with great bitterness on both sides. It ended with the Greek army driven back to the coast, and a catastrophic fire and evacuation at Izmir, and with the movement of populations that followed formalized in 1923 as a compulsory exchange, roughly 1.25 million Orthodox Christians moved from Anatolia to Greece, and around 400,000 Muslims moved from Greece to Turkey. The category used was religion, not language. Turkish-speaking Orthodox families who had never seen Greece were sent there. Greek-speaking Muslims who had never seen Anatolia were sent the other way. It is one of the clearest illustrations imaginable of what had changed. The Ottoman world had sorted people by faith and let them stay where they were. The nation-state world sorted people by faith and moved them. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara abolished the Sultanate. Mehmed VI, the 36th and last Sultan, left Istanbul aboard a British warship on the 17th of November. He died in exile in Italy 4 years later. The Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923 replaced Sèvres and recognized the new state's borders. The Republic of Turkey was proclaimed on the 29th of October 1923. And on the 3rd of March 1924, the Assembly abolished the Caliphate as well, and the remaining members of the House of Osman were sent into exile and were not permitted to return for decades. 623 years by the traditional reckoning, 36 rulers of one family, 3 continents, and it ended with a vote and a train. Let us gather this up gently now. What is left of it? More than you would think, and most of it is in places people do not look. Start with the map. Nearly every border dispute across a wide arc of the world today runs along a line drawn when Ottoman territory was divided. The frontiers of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, Kuwait, and much of the Balkans are all, directly or at one remove, the settlement of what happened to Ottoman provinces after 1918. The lines were drawn quickly by people far away, over territory that had been organized on completely different principles. Then the food, which is where the empire survives most affectionately and most contentiously. Coffee, as we began with. Yogurt, which reached Western Europe from these regions and whose name is Turkish, stuffed vine leaves, layered pastry with nuts and syrup, grilled meat on a skewer, small filled pastries and dumplings, a cold aniseed spirit that clouds when water is added, sold under different names from Greece to Lebanon. Nearly every one of those dishes is claimed passionately and sometimes officially by several modern nations, and the arguments are entirely sincere. The plain answer is that they were all part of one enormous shared kitchen for 4 or 5 centuries, and after the kitchen was divided, everybody kept cooking. Then the words, Turkish absorbed Arabic and Persian on a huge scale and then exported vocabulary outward in every direction. Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, Romanian, Albanian, Hungarian, and Arabic dialects across the Levant all carry Turkish loanwords in the hundreds, mostly for everyday things, household objects, foods, tools, administrative terms. Going the other way, English quietly took a handful without noticing. Kiosk from a garden pavilion, divan from a council chamber, and then the low seat around its walls. Yogurt, tulip, which comes from the Persian and Turkish word for turban because of the flower's shape. Caviar, coffee, sherbet, jackal, and hoard all arrived through this same broad channel. Then the buildings. Sinan's mosques still stand in Istanbul and Edirne. But so do bridges in Bosnia and Serbia, caravanserais on the old roads, clock towers in Balkan market squares, covered markets in Sarajevo and Skopje, fountains in Cairo and Damascus and Jerusalem, and thousands of small neighborhood mosques and baths across 3 continents, many still in use. And then the thing that is hardest to see, and probably matters most. For roughly 400 years, a very large part of the world's population lived in a state that did not require them to be the same as each other. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to slide into sentimentality, and the record does not support it. The Ottoman order was hierarchical, and non-Muslims were subordinate in law and in practice. There were periods of severe persecution. There were massacres, and the empire ended amid catastrophe. Nothing about the arrangement should be described as tolerance in the modern sense, because it was not built on a belief that all people are equal. It was built on a belief that different communities have different places, and that a well-run state keeps each of them in its own. But it did hold, and for a very long time. And while it held, a Greek and an Armenian and a Jew and a Turk could live in the same street, keep entirely different laws about marriage and inheritance, worship in different buildings, speak different languages at home, and be governed by the same sultan without anybody expecting that to change. And when that arrangement broke in the 19th and 20th centuries, it broke into the shape we live in now, states organized around a single nation, in which minorities are a problem to be solved rather than a normal condition of life, and in which populations get moved to make the map match the theory. There is a question inside, that which we have not finished with, and I do not think it can be answered quickly, and I am certainly not going to answer it tonight. Whether a shared political life requires a shared identity. What we owe to people we do not resemble, what is lost when a map is tidied. We are still working on that one, all of us, in every country there is. Let me bring you back now. Think of the people, not the sultans. The boy taken from a village in Bosnia who would never see his mother again, and who at 80 was the greatest architect in the world, buried in a small tomb beside a fountain he designed. The women in the court records arguing about a dowry in front of a judge 400 years ago and often winning, the families who sailed east from Spain in 1492 with the keys to houses they would never see again, some of which were still hanging in Salonika homes 4 centuries later. The boatmen on the Bosphorus rowing back and forth across that water all day, every day, for 600 years. The scribes, thousands of them, keeping the registers, village by village, field by field, in a fine hand, in ledgers that are still sitting in an archive in Istanbul and that historians are still working through. Somebody, on some quiet afternoon in the 1500s, in a low room with cushioned benches, setting down a small cup of coffee and picking up the conversation where it had been left. All of them are gone. The empire is gone. The city they lived in has burned down and been rebuilt more times than anyone counted. And the coffee is still made the same way, in a small long-handled pot, brought slowly to the edge of a boil, poured so the foam sits on top, with a glass of water beside it, and the grounds left in the bottom of the cup. That is what survives. Not the cannon and not the treaties. A way of making a drink, a word for a garden pavilion, a bridge over a river in Bosnia, a shape of a dome. You are here now in your room in the dark, with your body heavy and your breathing already slower than it was when we started. There is nothing left to follow. The tree in Osman's dream has grown and spread and come down, and the story is finished, and you may put it down entirely. Let the last names go. Let them drift off, like the sound of that call to prayer moving across the rooftops, one voice starting after another, further and further away. Rest now.